The morning air was still, heavy with the scent of dew and earth as the first hint of sunlight began to creep over the edge of the horizon. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird stirring in the trees. Yet, in the distance, something moved, a figure stumbling through the underbrush, moving awkwardly, dragging its body as if each step was a battle. It was a dog, her fur matted with dirt and grime, her body slumped in exhaustion. Her eyes, wide with pain and confusion, locked onto the stranger standing near the woodshed, a man who had been going about his early chores. His gloved hands were still gripping a rake, the day's work beginning as the sun barely touched the sky. At first, the man didn't understand what he was seeing. The dog, despite her obvious distress, seemed to be making a purposeful effort to reach him. Her legs, weak and trembling, struggled to carry her forward, but still she came closer, the soft sound of her breath reaching his ears. The dog's cry was faint, barely more than a whimper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. The man's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes, dark and filled with fear, met his gaze, and for a moment everything around him seemed to fade. There was no need for words. In that brief instant, he understood. This dog wasn't just lost. She was in trouble, desperate trouble. As she drew nearer, she stumbled, her legs giving way beneath her, and with a soft thud, she collapsed in front of him. Her sides heaved with every strained breath, the weight of whatever had been troubling her now manifesting in her fragile form. She did not bark, did not growl. She simply lay there, on her side, trembling uncontrollably. The only sounds she made were soft, guttural moans of pain, a deep distress that seemed to echo in the man's chest. The man stepped forward cautiously, unsure of what to do, his instincts pushing him to help but his experience telling him to be gentle, to proceed slowly. He crouched down beside the dog, careful not to make any sudden moves. Her fur was unkempt, her ribs visible beneath the layers of matted hair, but it was the look in her eyes that struck him most. They were wide, pupils dilated and filled with something primal, fear, trust, a plea for help that no words could express. "Hey, girl." "It's okay," the man murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper. His heart tightened, and he knew that words were useless here. The dog's body trembled even more, but she didn't pull away. She didn't lash out. Instead, she let out another faint, mournful sound, her head turning just enough to acknowledge his presence, to show that she recognized him as something more than a stranger. But that recognition was fleeting, as if she had only the strength to reach out with her eyes, and no more. With careful hands, the man placed a palm gently on her back, trying to assess her condition. She winced slightly, but didn't flinch away. Her skin was warm beneath his touch, but her body had no strength left to move. There were no visible signs of obvious injury, no broken bones or bleeding cuts, but the way her body had been dragged across the ground, the way she had moved with such difficulty, told him this was more than just physical trauma. She was exhausted, broken in a way that wasn't immediately obvious. The man felt a tug in his chest. Something about the dog's condition seemed different. She wasn't just in pain, she was drained, as if she had been running for days, maybe longer, without a clear destination, just driven by a need to survive. And now she had found him. Her body spoke of a journey that was far more than simple exhaustion. This was the culmination of a struggle, a battle that had taken its toll on her in ways that went beyond what the man could immediately understand. He leaned down, his face close to hers now, his voice quiet and calm. "You're not alone," he said softly. She seemed to hear him, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if reassured by the sound of his voice. There was a quiet shift in the air as the bond between the two formed in that shared moment of stillness. No words needed to be exchanged. The man knew instinctively that this dog had come to him for a reason. And though her body was clearly in distress, there was a sense of urgency in the way she clung to him. Even in her weakened state, her struggle had not ended. It had simply led her here. The man stood, backing away slowly, his eyes never leaving the dog as she struggled to rise to her feet. She was still shaking, but there was something in the way she moved now, something tentative yet trusting, a silent agreement that she would follow him. She was willing, despite everything. The man understood. It was more than just physical help she needed. It was something deeper, a shared connection that transcended the simple act of rescue. He guided her, step by cautious step, toward the small shelter near his barn. Each movement was slow, deliberate. The dog followed, though her body sagged with exhaustion, her steps uneven. The man remained beside her, never pushing, always patient. Her eyes flicked toward him from time to time as if checking that he was still there, that she was not alone in her silent struggle. The dog's pace slowed even more as they neared the shelter, her legs barely lifting with each step. The man's heart ached, but he remained steady, offering only what she needed, the simple reassurance that she was safe now, that no matter what had brought her here, she wouldn't face it alone anymore. When they reached the shelter, the man carefully helped her inside, guiding her toward a bed of straw in the far corner. He crouched beside her as she collapsed onto it, her body finally allowing her to rest. But even then, she didn't sleep immediately. She lay still, breathing shallowly, eyes wide as if she were still watching for something. The man sat beside her, keeping vigil, waiting. He didn't know what had happened to this dog or what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain. She had come to him for help, and he would offer whatever he could. And as he sat there in the quiet of the barn, the dog's breaths slowing just a little, he realized that the journey they had started together had only just begun. There was much more ahead for them both. The man paused for a moment, his hand hovering just above the dog's trembling body. Her fur was heavy with dirt, matted to her skin as though she had been dragged through the brush for miles. There was no sign of deep cuts or gashes, but the more the man examined her, the more he noticed something that troubled him, a subtle tension in the way she held herself. She was not simply exhausted, there was something else beneath the surface, something he couldn't quite place. Her breathing came in sharp, shallow bursts, her ribs pressing against the tightness of her skin with each labored inhale. He could feel the weight of her exhaustion, the slow but steady rhythm of a body that had endured more than it should. The stranger's gaze dropped to her belly, swollen and taut, the skin stretching uncomfortably over the contours of her body. It wasn't a shape that spoke of simply being underfed or dehydrated. The dog was pregnant and she was far too close to her time, yet too weakened to face what was ahead of her. The realization hit him like a cold wind. His heart sank, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't afford to panic now, not when this fragile creature was relying on him. He moved his hands slowly, gently, as if the slightest sudden movement might break the delicate balance of trust that had already begun to form between them. The dog's body flinched slightly at his touch, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she gave a soft whimper, a sound that seemed to echo in the stillness of the morning. Her eyes, once wide with fear, had softened just a little. For a brief moment, their gazes met. The dog's trust was fragile, but it was there, and though she couldn't voice it, the stranger could sense her need for help, her desire to escape whatever torment had brought her to this point. He understood in that quiet exchange that he couldn't leave her to face this alone. He leaned down, keeping his movements slow and controlled, his hand moving gently over her belly again, feeling the subtle shifts beneath the skin. It wasn't just the weight of the pregnancy, it was the discomfort, the pain, that seemed to radiate from her in waves. His mind raced as he tried to think through his options. There was no time to waste, but he needed to make the right choice. The dog's condition could deteriorate quickly, but the shelter was only a short distance away. He had to get her there. Yet, as he stood back up and stepped away, he felt the tug of something else, the fragility of the moment, the weight of the decision. He had no real way of knowing whether this was just the exhaustion from a long journey or the beginning of something far more urgent, something only time could reveal. "Shh. It's okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if she could even hear him. The words were a mere whisper, barely carried by the breeze. They weren't meant to soothe her. They were meant to soothe him, to calm the racing of his own mind. He moved to the side, gently gesturing for the dog to follow. She hesitated, a small tremor passing through her body as she gathered what little strength remained. Her paws, unsteady and weak, shifted on the ground as she tried to rise. She was clearly in pain, but she managed to lift herself slowly, as if every inch of movement cost her something vital. The stranger watched, his heart tight with concern, but he didn't move too quickly. There was no rush. After a moment's pause, the dog took a tentative step forward, her body sagging with the effort. The stranger remained calm, his voice soft, almost inaudible. "Come on, girl, you're almost there." It wasn't a command, but a quiet invitation, a reassurance that she wasn't alone. Slowly, step by labored step, the dog began to follow him. Her gait was uneven, her paws dragging with every movement, but she kept pace with him. Her eyes, still filled with a mix of fear and exhaustion, held a flicker of something else, something almost like hope. The weight of the moment settled around them, and the world beyond the small shelter seemed to fade away. All that mattered was the steady rhythm of their movements, the quiet trust that had begun to form. The shelter, a humble structure near the barn, came into view as they made their way through the soft earth. The dog's pace slowed, and the stranger moved alongside her, never pushing but always there, steady, unyielding. Her breath still came in ragged bursts, but with each step, it seemed to become just a little bit less labored. There was something reassuring in the silence, something grounding in the rhythm of their journey. He knew, deep down, that there was no turning back. He couldn't leave her now. When they finally reached the shelter, the dog paused, her body shaking with exhaustion. The stranger gently coaxed her inside, where soft straw and hay were piled high, waiting to cushion her fragile frame. The dog didn't resist, though she hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously around the unfamiliar space. But once she was inside, she lowered herself to the ground with a soft grunt, curling her body into a tight ball, her eyes never leaving the stranger. He stood there for a moment, watching her, unsure of what to do next. But he didn't need to do anything. The dog had found her place, and she was ready to rest. Her breathing slowed, though the strain in her chest remained. And the stranger's heart ached at the thought of what might still lie ahead. With a soft sigh, he stepped back, watching from the doorway as the dog settled in. She didn't look up, but the shift in her demeanor was palpable. She had found a moment of safety, a small, fragile peace. The stranger took a slow breath, his mind racing through the possibilities. There was no certainty in this moment, no easy answers. But for now, he had done what he could. He had given the dog a chance to rest, a chance to heal, whatever that might mean. As he closed the door gently behind him, he allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. The road ahead was still unclear, but for now they were together, and that was enough. The barn was quiet except for the soft rustle of straw beneath the dog's body and the occasional shift of her legs. She had settled onto the makeshift bed the stranger had prepared, a nest of warm straw and a thick blanket to cushion her tired form. The man moved slowly, his every step deliberate, mindful not to disturb the fragile calm that had settled over her. She had stopped trembling, her body no longer racked with the sharp shakes of pain or exhaustion. Yet her breathing remained uneven, short bursts, the sound of her chest rising and falling quickly, still heavy with the weight of what was to come. The dog's body had stopped its frantic movements, but something was still wrong. As the man sat beside her, his hand lightly resting on her back, he began to notice the deeper signs. The tautness of her belly was more than just discomfort. It was the unmistakable tension of a mother-to-be. her body already beginning the slow, painful journey of labor. It was as if she had been running on empty for days, and now, in this quiet barn, she was about to face the most difficult part of her journey alone. As the minutes passed, the dog let out a soft, involuntary moan. Her body tensed, then relaxed, only to stiffen again with the force of another contraction. The stranger stayed close, but he said nothing. There was nothing more he could offer than his presence. He had no medical knowledge, no experience in delivering puppies, and yet he felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. His every instinct told him to stay calm, to give her space, but to remain close enough that she could feel his presence. He wouldn't leave her side, not now. The barn seemed to grow still, the air heavy with anticipation. The only sounds were the faint rustling of straw and the soft, laborious breath of the dog. The man's eyes never left her, watching as her body continued to contract. There was no rush, no frantic energy. Everything was slow, steady. He knew that forcing the process would only harm her. Instead, he focused on the quiet rhythm of her movements, each breath a steady reminder of the patience required in these moments. For the dog, the world outside the barn didn't matter. It was just her and the stranger, waiting in the quiet space they had created together. Her eyes, once filled with fear and confusion, softened slightly as she realized the man wasn't here to harm her. She could feel his calm, his steady presence grounding her. Though still frightened, the edge of her distress began to fade, replaced by a fragile sense of trust. Her body began to relax just a little, as if it understood that the stranger would not rush her, that she could take her time. The pain, though still sharp, seemed to lessen as she allowed herself to be held in the space between the contractions, in the space of waiting. The man, though still uncertain of how to help, knew that he could not take control. This was the dog's journey, and he could only offer support, his hands steady and his heart calm. He sat with her, offering nothing but the quiet companionship that seemed to ease the tension in the room. Minutes passed, maybe hours, as the dog labored in quiet solitude, the man never leaving her side. When the first puppy finally arrived, it came slowly, emerging in a rush of wet fur and gentle whimpers. The dog, though weak from exhaustion, turned her head toward the small creature immediately, her instincts kicking in. She licked the tiny body clean with a tenderness that only a mother could possess. The stranger, watching in quiet awe, felt his chest tighten with emotion. The scene before him was raw, intimate, and fragile, a new life brought into the world in the midst of uncertainty, of fear, and of pain. The dog, though trembling, nuzzled her newborn puppy, her breathing still irregular but beginning to slow. She looked up at the man for a brief moment, as if seeking reassurance, and he nodded, offering her a quiet, gentle phrase. "You're doing great." It was little more than a murmur, a soft breath of encouragement in the quiet stillness of the barn. The dog responded only with the softest of whines, as if acknowledging his presence, but her attention quickly returned to her puppy. She nuzzled it closer, her body curling protectively around it. The world outside continued on, untouched by the quiet miracle unfolding within the barn. There were no dramatic moments, no loud outbursts. The barn was filled only with the soft sounds of a mother caring for her newborn, of a stranger offering silent comfort. It was a space carved out of time, a place where nothing mattered but this moment, this life, and the bond between them. The dog continued her labor, each new puppy arriving in its own time. The stranger watched each one carefully, offering soft words of encouragement, though he knew that there was little he could do. His presence was all he could offer, his calm the only thing he could give her. And slowly, as the puppies continued to arrive, the dog's body began to relax. Her breathing grew steadier, her movements less frantic. She had been through so much, and yet, in the space of a few hours, something miraculous had happened. She was no longer alone. When the last puppy was born, the dog collapsed back onto the straw, exhausted but content. The man gently helped her adjust her position, making sure she was comfortable, her puppies close by. They were small, fragile things, their tiny bodies twitching with the instinct to nurse. The dog, still weak, gathered them in close, her eyes soft and tired as she settled into the bed of straw. The stranger, having done all he could, stayed by her side, watching quietly as she began to rest. In that moment, the barn became a quiet sanctuary, a place where time moved at its own pace, where the outside world could not touch them. The dog, once so terrified and alone, had found peace in this small, humble space. The stranger, his heart still racing from the miracle he had witnessed, took a deep breath and stepped back. He didn't need to stay anymore. The dog and her puppies were safe now. As the dog closed her eyes and drifted into a much-needed sleep, the man stood in the doorway of the barn for a moment, watching the quiet scene before him. The wind stirred the leaves outside, but within the barn, there was nothing but stillness and the quiet rhythm of a mother and her newborns. The man knew that, for now, there was nothing more to do. He had done what he could, and in that there was a quiet sense of fulfillment. The barn was silent again, and for the first time, the man felt that peace was settling over them both. The last of the puppies had arrived, a small, fragile creature that let out a soft whimper as it found its way to the warmth of its mother's side. The dog, though exhausted, moved instinctively, gathering her newborns close to her, nudging them into a protective circle with gentle movements. Her body, once trembling and weak, now seemed at peace. She lay still, her eyes half closed as she rested, her sides rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. The pain was still there, but it was quieter now, replaced by the quiet rhythm of a mother's care. The puppies, tiny and fragile, instinctively nursed at her side, their tiny bodies finding the warmth they so desperately needed. The man remained beside them, watching over the new family, ensuring that the dog was comfortable, that the puppies were safe. His heart, once heavy with the weight of uncertainty, now carried a quiet peace. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the bond that had slowly formed between him and this weary, frightened dog. But now, as he sat quietly in the barn, watching the new mother and her pups, he realized that the bond was no longer just one of necessity. It had become something deeper, something unspoken. It was trust, built through actions, through silence, through simple moments of understanding. As the dog lay there, her eyes soft but watchful, the stranger moved quietly around the barn, gathering the supplies he would need to ensure their safety. He moved with care, his actions slow and deliberate. There was no rush. He had learned in these past hours that there was no hurry. The dog had made it through the hardest part of her journey, and now she needed time. Time to rest. Time to heal. The man worked in quiet, steady movements, preparing a space for the family, making sure the area was safe and secure. He checked the door, made sure there was enough straw for the dog and her pups, and set up a small water bowl nearby. He moved as if he had all the time in the world, though he knew that time for the dog and her new family was something fragile. Still, he didn't rush. There was something sacred about these moments, something about the stillness of the barn that made the world feel far away. When everything was set, he returned to the dog's side. She hadn't moved much, but her eyes followed him, her gaze steady, calm. There was a trust there now, one that hadn't been there before. The fear had subsided, replaced by something quieter, something more cautious but no less important. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She watched him, her eyes soft but filled with gratitude. She was still cautious, still unsure in some ways, but the bond they shared had grown. There were no promises exchanged, no words spoken, but the understanding between them was clear. He was there for her. He was there for her pups. And, in her own quiet way, she had accepted that. The puppies, having nursed for some time, were now settled at her side, their tiny bodies curled up against her warmth. The barn had fallen silent, save for the soft, rhythmic sound of the dog's breathing and the occasional rustle of straw as the puppies shifted in their sleep. The man stepped back slowly, careful not to disturb the quiet peace that had settled over the family. He stood for a moment, watching, as the dog rested with her pups, her body still but her mind no longer racing with fear. She had found a place to rest, a place where she could heal. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the barn, the light filtering in through the cracks in the wood. The man stepped outside, the door creaking softly behind him. He breathed in the cool air, letting it fill his lungs. The day was quiet now, the wind soft against his skin. It was a moment of stillness, a moment that felt like a pause in time. The small family was safe. They were out of the world's reach, protected in the quiet of the barn. And for the first time in a long while, the man felt at peace. He sat down on a nearby crate, his back against the barn wall. The dogs were inside, resting. The man knew that there was still much to do, that the journey ahead would require patience, care, and time. But for now, he allowed himself to breathe, to settle into the quiet of the moment. The world outside could wait. As he sat there, his thoughts drifted back to the dog, to the bond they had shared in these quiet hours. He had not expected this. He had not expected to feel this connection. But he had. The dog had trusted him, and in turn, he had trusted her. They had both come through something difficult, something painful, and now, together, they had found a space to rest. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the barnyard. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the grass outside, but the barn remained calm, peaceful. Inside, the dog shifted slightly, her eyes still open but heavy with the weight of sleep. The puppies, now full and content, lay still beside her, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each slow breath. The barn was their sanctuary now, a place where the world could not touch them, where they could rest and heal. The man stood up slowly, his body stiff from sitting for so long. He stretched, his muscles aching from the quiet hours of waiting. As he turned to head back inside, he glanced toward the horizon. The sky had begun to darken, the last light of the day fading into the quiet of evening. The air was cooler now, the scent of the earth stronger, sharper. He returned to the barn, the door creaking softly behind him as he stepped inside. The dog and her pups were still there, still resting. The man stood for a moment in the doorway, watching them quietly. There was no rush. There was no need for anything more right now. The day had ended, and in that stillness he realized something. This moment, this simple peace, was enough. It was all they needed. Outside, the wind continued to stir the grass, and the last of the sunlight faded into the horizon. The barn, quiet and still, held the dog and her pups in its warmth. And in that space, the stranger, too, had found his own peace. It was a small thing, a quiet thing, but it was enough, and that was enough for him. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the barnyard, a golden light filled the small space, soft and warm, like a gentle embrace. The dog, her body still weary but no longer trembling with exhaustion, lifted her head slowly. Her eyes, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now carried only peace. She gazed at the man with quiet trust, her posture steady as she rose from the straw. The pups, nestled beside her, shifted in their sleep, their tiny bodies wriggling slightly as they sought warmth. The barn, which had been their refuge for days, now seemed like a temporary shelter, a place of healing, not of permanence. The stranger stood silently, watching as the dog stretched, her movements slow but purposeful. She no longer looked lost or afraid. The weight of her burdens had lessened. The pain that had once ruled her body was now replaced with something softer, something that belonged to a mother who had found solace. She raised her head, her gaze meeting his, and for a moment. There was no rush in her movements. She lingered there, eyes steady, as if taking in the space, the safety she had found before preparing to leave. Without warning, the dog gave a soft huff, a quiet exhalation that seemed to break the stillness of the room. Her nose nudged her pups, each of them still deeply asleep, and she prodded them gently, coaxing them awake. They stirred, their tiny bodies stretching, soft whimpers escaping as they sought their mother's warmth. It was a quiet movement, a gentle command, and in the way she nudged them, there was a calm authority, a maternal instinct that had been revived in the calm of this barn. The man took a slow step forward, crouching down to meet her gaze. But he didn't try to touch her this time. He simply looked into her eyes, offering the same quiet understanding he had offered since they had first met. There were no words between them. None were needed. He could see it in her eyes. She was no longer the fearful, fragile creature who had stumbled into his care. She was strong again, her body ready to return to the wild. She didn't need to stay in the barn anymore. Her journey was calling her to something beyond this place. As if confirming this understanding, the dog nudged her pups once more, and with a final glance at the man, she began to move toward the barn's open door. Her body was steady now, no longer dragging with weakness. The pups, small and unsteady on their feet, followed closely behind, their tiny paws clicking softly against the ground as they trailed after their mother. There was a quiet sense of finality in the way she moved, a natural progression. The wild was calling, and she was answering, guiding her family toward the next chapter of their lives. The stranger remained where he stood, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions. There was no sadness in the departure, no sense of loss. Instead, there was a quiet, deep gratitude. He understood. He had given them what they needed, but now the time had come for them to reclaim what was theirs. The dog, her pups, they were part of the wild, and he had been only a fleeting part of their journey. A moment of connection, a quiet bond, forged in the unspoken understanding between them. The dog paused just outside the barn, her body turned toward the stranger, her head held high, the fading light of the day catching the edges of her fur. She didn't look back, but the glance she gave him was enough. It was the kind of look that said, "Thank you," without uttering a single word. Then, with one final movement, she turned, and with her pups trailing closely behind, she walked into the growing shadows, disappearing into the vastness of the world beyond the barn. The stranger remained in the doorway, his gaze fixed on them as they slowly made their way toward the distant tree line, the world stretching wide before them. The wind stirred the tall grasses around the barn, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft rustling of the earth. It felt as if time had stopped. In that stillness, the man could almost feel the presence of the dog, the quiet strength she had shared with him, her trust, and the peace that had settled over them both. There was nothing more to be said. No farewell, no promises, only the slow, steady movement of the dog and her pups, making their way toward a future unknown, yet theirs to claim. The stranger's heart was full, not of sadness but of something deeper, more lasting. The bond they had shared, brief but powerful, would stay with him forever. He would carry that moment with him, always the memory of the dog, her pups, and the quiet trust they had formed. As the last of the sunlight faded behind the trees, the barn grew darker, but it no longer felt empty. The space was filled with the quiet echoes of what had transpired, the soft imprint of a mother and her pups who had found their way. The man turned and closed the door behind him, the faint sound of the wind brushing against the barn walls the only reminder of the moment that had passed. Outside, the dog and her family had disappeared into the distance, their figures becoming silhouettes against the darkening sky. The stranger stood for a moment, his eyes lingering on the place where they had been, and then, with a final deep breath, he turned and walked back into the quiet of his home. The day was fading, but in his heart, the warmth of that quiet goodbye would remain, like the soft glow of the setting sun, gentle, unwavering, and filled with a quiet peace.